Let's review a really intense fight scene set during World War I. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and one of the things I do on this channel is I review fight scenes from a view of historical correctness, but also just entertainment and everything else. So from the view of someone who practices martial arts, collects and deals in weapons and trains people how to use historical weaponry in historical ways, what do I think of it? So, this movie is The King's Man. Released in 2021, this film, at least part of it, is set during World War I, and there's a particularly intense fight scene set in no man's land between the German and British lines, in this case, trenches. Now, one thing I want to say before I jump into this is, obviously, this is a Hollywood movie, okay? So it's entertainment. There are some parts of it which clearly are not historically accurate, but there's some parts that are. We're going to talk about that. But also I want to, because it's World War I and because it's more recent than most of the things I look at on this channel, I just want to point out that obviously some degree of sensitivity, because I grew up knowing people who fought in World War I. Certainly if you're a British person, numerous members of your family were probably involved in World War I. Certainly numerous members of mine were. So, you know, full kind of remembrance to them and the tragedy of that war, because it was a stupid war that probably shouldn't have happened and could have possibly been prevented. But anyway, that's a topic for perhaps a different channel, certainly for a different video. Anyway, as a fight scene, let's look at this, because World War I is one of those wars where, despite the fact it's in the 20th century, we did get lots of hand-to-hand combat. One of the reasons for that is because of the nature of trench warfare, which I'm sure lots of you know about, but I've done lots of videos in the past talking about this, so check those out. Now, let's jump into this scene. Okay, so, you know, to set the scene, they're creeping along, they've come out of their trenches, they're essentially in no man's land. This often wasn't a particularly wide amount of distance between one line of trenches and the other. And as part and parcel of being a militaria dealer, an arms and armour dealer, I've researched a lot of first-hand accounts, descriptive accounts, diaries of this time by people who were actually involved in these raids. And I think there's a perception that these were always nighttime. They weren't actually, they were daytime, many daytime attacks on trenches. But this is a nighttime raid. Now, obviously a nighttime raid has a certain characteristic to it, and one of those things is being quiet. That's something which will come up in this scene again. So the standard armament, at least for the British in this, is a rifle with a bayonet. It's the SMLE, the short magazine Lee Enfield, with the 1907 pattern long bayonet attached to the end of it. And this is the standard armament of a British infantryman. The officers, by this point, carried just revolvers. Initially in 1914, when the war started, pretty much all officers in all militaries carried also a sword, which is obviously something we talk about a lot on this channel. But by late 1914 and really 1915, most officers, certainly on the Western Front, had stopped carrying swords, the primary reason being because it made them too easy to spot by enemy marksmen. So officers were getting absolutely wiped out because everybody on the other side could see which one the officer was, and obviously officers are very important for command and control, and so they were shooting the officers first. So officers died at a much higher rate than private soldiers, in fact, at that point. So they stopped carrying swords, so they were less easy to spot, and they just carried revolvers after that. That's not to say that they stopped carrying swords because swords weren't important weapons, because the irony, as we're going to see in this scene, is that hand weapons actually were hugely important and very widely used in the trenches of World War I on the Western Front. All sorts of hand weapons. We'll talk about the weapons in a second, but the most common weapon, as we'll see here, was the knife, the so-called trench knife or trench dagger, which came in many different forms and very often was just a straightforward knife. Now, the standard armament, however, was the bayonet on the rifle. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's watch a bit more of this scene. And you can see there that the infantrymen have their SMLE short magazine Lee-Enfield rifles with the 1907 long bayonet on the end, and the officer has a revolver. It should be pointed out, incidentally, that the reason the bayonets are still so long at this point is because you've got to bear in mind they're coming out of a 19th century mentality. Number one, they're expecting lots of bayonet fighting. In fact, there was far less in World War I than they expected. But in bayonet fighting, reach is really quite important. So they'd shortened the length of the rifles for the most part. The Germans were using a Mauser, the British were using an Enfield, and the French were using various other rifles. But they had shortened the length of the rifles, and so therefore they had to keep the bayonets long, because if you end up having drastically less reach than your opponent, you're going to be outreached by them. That's the first thing. The second thing is cavalry. They expected that infantry would be charged by cavalry, as they had been for decades. And not just cavalry as well, but you've got to remember that these nations, at least the British and the French and various others like the Italians, they were used to fighting colonial wars as well, and in colonial wars they were often fighting people with spears and shields and swords and things like this. So it was important to have a rifle and a bayonet that still had a long reach on it. So the basic setup here is the British soldiers and the German soldiers have met in no man's land, and they are there to fight, okay? But they know that if they make a noise, then one side or the other side or both sides will start shooting, okay? Now, in the dark, with fog and perhaps smoke and other things, they are worried about getting caught in the crossfire in no man's land. So they are essentially making a sort of gentleman's agreement to have a fight without shooting, okay? So, as we see, there we go. So they lay down their firearms, their rifles and put the revolver away, and instead choose the hand weapons, primarily knives, but also other things we'll see in a second. Now, this does make sense within the story, okay? However, I just want to point out that really the primary hand-to-hand combat weapon for all soldiers on any side at this point is the bayonet on the end of the rifle. That's why it's there. If the rifle was just a shooting implement, you wouldn't put the bayonet on the end. So when I first watched this, I was like, hold on, you're gonna have a hand-to-hand fight. Why not keep the bayonet? Because of all the hand weapons you could be using, the bayonet on the end of the rifle, which is essentially a really heavy spear, is one of the best weapons you could have. Someone with a rifle and bayonet in an open area can absolutely dominate someone who's only got a knife or only got a hatchet or something. But here's the thing. One other thing that's really important to know is that in the trenches of World War I, they're not in a trench at the moment, we'll come back to that, but in the trenches of World War I, they did actually find that long rifles or long bayonets on rifles actually were somewhat cumbersome in the trenches. So that's one of the reasons that they started very commonly carrying trench knives, shovels, clubs, all of these sorts of weapons, because in a confined space, in a melee in a trench, in a zigzag line trench, a long straight thrusting weapon is probably not the best weapon to have. So although they did still use bayonets a lot, they did carry other things as well. Okay, so in this situation, they're not in a trench, they're above ground. Just so you know, they would have been better off fighting with their rifle and bayonet, but within the context of this story, I can excuse it because they're making a gentleman's agreement to have a knife fight, essentially, okay? And because they're saying no shooting, they want to take away that temptation by putting the rifles down. Anyway, let's see how the fight pans out. Right, so we've seen various weapons there, including, that's a very cool one, including a gauntlet. I'll come back to that in a second. So various things we've seen, various types of knife, we've seen a hammer, we later on see a hatchet or axe, we've seen, I think there's a trench club there. Now, if I just grab a knife for a second. So, you will notice that most of them are holding the daggers in that way. In fact, we know in this period, knives were often held point up, and often held point down. It's really personal preference. It depends what the situation is, and you can switch in the blink of an eye if you're well trained. So really, either one will work. But in this case, most of them are holding the blades point down like that. Anyway, let's carry on with this. Oh, and the gauntlet. I almost forgot it. So is that a complete fantasy thing? Not entirely, although this particular form that they've shown, there are some ones in museums that look a bit like this, okay? Because of the lighting, because it's very dark, it's not possible for me to say if it's exactly like the ones that were made during World War I, but there were ones made like this. In terms of the historical basis, you find Romans sometimes in gladiatorial have a gladiatorial fighters. I can't remember which class of gladiator it is. Sometimes have this type of thing. It's a little bit similar to an Indian pata or gauntlet sword as well. So it has various parallels in history. And it should be pointed out when they got into trench fighting in World War I, they drew lots of inspiration on earlier periods of weapons and even made up some essentially fantasy weapons of their own. So they did have flails, they had flexi spring-headed maces, all sorts of stuff, and they even had helmets with visors with slits and stuff on. So very, very cool, and I like the fact they've probably gone to somewhere like the Imperial War Museum to research this, and they've come up with some really good things. Oh, before I forget as well, the Germans almost all the time have gas masks on. That is a plot device, okay? That is a plot device because we're supposed to take morally the side of the British in this particular scene because they're the heroes of this story. And so therefore it's to dehumanize the German opponents. But at the moments when we're supposed to emotionally engage with the Germans, their faces are revealed, as we'll see. Okay, so the gas masks would be awful to fight in, terrible, give you tunnel vision essentially. They'd be really reduce your ability to fight effectively having that mask on. Obviously, if there'd been a gas attack, you'd have to fight with them on, and they did do that. But the British, as we see here, don't have masks on, so clearly it's just a plot device. I really love how this scene is shot, the way it's, you know, you can hear the breathing, especially in the gas mask, and then it pans out and looks from above, so it gives you almost like a kind of wargamer's view of what's going on. I think it's wonderfully tense. The sound, the low-key background music, I really like it. I think this is an awesome scene. Now, another little detail, you'll notice how they're staying really low and creeping along. This would be kind of weird in any other context, but the whole idea here is they're trying not to raise the enemy's attentions and get shot. So they're trying to creep around, so it kind of makes sense. But it also kind of gives them almost a sort of zombie-like creeping kind of, it just makes the whole thing a little bit more intimidating. Right, I'm just going to pause there. So obviously we had a couple of people immediately kind of get taken out of the scene. That's good. It makes it very aggressive and very intense. It's not very realistic, of course, because that would not necessarily be a sensible way of attacking someone with a knife if they were also holding a knife, which is the case here. But then what results, it gets those two people out of the way. It's a bit like unfurling the curtain, so choreographically and cinematically it looks fantastic. And then it comes down to the two main protagonists here wrestling over a knife. And it should be said, there's a couple of things to bear in mind here. One is that knife fighting, especially when both people have got knives, will often devolve into scrambling around on the ground. It's not going to look like fencing, it's not going to look pretty, it's not even going to look like jiu-jitsu. It's going to look like two people frantically trying to control the other person's knife while getting their own knife into the opponent. It's going to look messy, it's going to look brutal, and they've really captured that in this scene. I love it. Obviously it's on the ground rolling around as they would be. But there's an important point here which I think not everyone watching this video would be aware of, and that is that they are heavily clothed, okay? They are wearing helmets or at least hats. They have heavy, autumn winter clothing on, so they've got multiple layers of wool and in some case other equipment, bandoliers, belts, all of this kind of stuff. When you've got all of that stuff on, you're actually not a very easy target to stab. As we're going to see here, you're kind of lightly armoured. To put it in like a medieval or Renaissance context, you've essentially got light armour on because you've got multiple layers of fabric. So you can't really slash with a knife because there's no bare skin. You can't slash through multiple layers of wool. Various people on the internet have made good tests of this, weapon tests, and demonstrated this. Obviously, I've experienced this myself during test cutting experiments and experimental archaeology. So it would be almost entirely stabbing, number one, but secondly, stabbing at particular weak points. And we're actually going to see that in the fight. Good. I love the kick there. I love the striking because, you know, using your fists and your elbows, your head, your knee, your foot, all of this stuff to try and get the person off you so you can stab into a weak point. Really, really good. It looks like a real fight. Right, okay, so that guy there is using a hatchet. It might look like a tomahawk to you, but I can tell you as a militaria dealer, that's a fireman's axe. Now, there were military ones of these. They're usually a bit later. They actually had these in aircraft, in bombers during World War II. So this is probably a World War II era, could be military, could be civilian, fire axe. It's for basically chopping your way into or out of buildings, burning aircraft, ships, whatever. However, axes like this were based on boarding axes. So boarding axes were a type of axe used in the age of sail. So in naval warfare, going all the way back into the 17th and 18th centuries, the age of piracy. And then they'd assumed this shape by the middle of the 19th century and were used as boarding axes. This is too short to be a boarding axe. But anyway, it sort of gives the impression of an axe that could have been a military issue or naval axe of this time. This is obviously middle of the Second World War. I guess it's about 1916. Sorry, First World War, 1916. But yeah, it's great to see an axe in there. And these were, as well as knives and daggers of various sorts, which were hugely popular and carried by basically everyone in the trenches in World War I. They did also use clubs with spikes in the end, various types of mace and flail, axe, sharpened shovels, all of this kind of stuff. So bludgeoning and stabbing weapons, great to see an axe in there. So there we've got someone using what's clearly a sledgehammer head on a short handle, so a bit like a large club hammer. Now, I actually think this would make a particularly poor weapon for trench fighting. Not to say, obviously, it's bad being hit by a heavy hammer. However, this is a particularly unwieldy type of hammer. Just a typical claw hammer would have been a better hammer to use because it'd be more nimble, like a tomahawk basically. But I would say if I was choosing the weapons that we see in this scene, I'd definitely take a knife and a hatchet. What would you take out of interest? If you were in World War I in the trenches, what hand weapons would you choose? Obviously you'd choose a handgun if you had one available, but if you, aside from that, what hand weapons would you choose? I'd absolutely choose a hatchet and a large knife or dagger. Right, okay, so although that's brutal, stabbing in here is obviously a weak point. So generally speaking, no matter how much clothing and even armour that you've got on, even modern body armour, generally speaking, you can't really armour this top bit of the neck in here going downwards because you need to be able to move your head around. That's why medieval helmets like great bassinets, which restrict your head, but they do protect this, are quite unusual. Most types of armour or helmet or anything else leave some sort of weak spot that you can get to underneath here. And in this case, although they're not wearing armour per se, they're wearing World War I soldiers' clothing in the winter, this is going to be a weak spot and it's always going to be easier to stab somewhere there is less clothing. So it shows that the choreographer for this scene really understood what they were doing. Right, so that was important. Pulling the mask off It's humanizing. As we're going to see in a second, there is a reason why most of the German soldiers have gas masks on here, because it's a plot device to dehumanize them and make them just generic baddies like stormtroopers in Star Wars. But here we want to humanize the person because we want to make the scene more poignant, so we take the mask off. So he's on top of the opponent, and anybody who's done BJJ or jiu-jitsu or judo or anything like that will obviously know that, generally speaking, if you're on top of a person, you have the advantage due to gravity and the way your muscles are put together, weight, and especially with knives and daggers, if you're on top of someone and you're trying to push a dagger down, you can put all of your body weight behind it. In fact, this is a concept which is shown in the medieval and Renaissance treatises. Fiore describes this technical term, più fortezza, which just means more force. So if you go to stab and someone blocks, you bring up the second hand here and push it home with the second hand. So it's applying more force to the situation. And obviously he's reluctant to kill this guy because he's demasked him and humanized him. And we're showing the humanity of the hero here, but the fact that he doesn't want to cold-bloodedly just kill someone, but he's just seen his comrade and friend die at the hands of these masked automatons. And so he now realizes what he's got to do. This is his moment where it's kill or be killed. And we've even got the Darth Vader breathing to make them even more evil. And of course, it's one of the guys is obviously the one with the gauntlet with the dagger out of the top, because that's like a boss level baddie weapon, isn't it? We knew from the outset, yeah, everybody's got a knife, but we know that when we see that big hammer and when we see that gauntlet with the spike out of the end, that is subconsciously or consciously, you tell me, we know that those are the boss levels of this team. They're the bosses of this team. They're the big baddies. Yeah, so, you know, it's brutal, it's horrible. I don't want to glamorize this kind of thing, but he does go for a less armored point, and that is good. That is accurate. When someone's covered in thick winter clothing, you go for their neck. So there was a really nice bit there where he goes under a blow, but then he stabs the dagger into the shoulder joint, I think. Anyway, it's somewhere up here. But that's a really, really nice thing, because there's a detail in some rapier treatises where they talk about thrusting the opponent in the shoulder or arm, because it's a way of stopping their weapon from coming back at you. So while we might talk about the lethality or incapacitation effects of certain targets, obviously throat, head, heart, these are the vitals, but sometimes stabs into bits of limbs and stuff can actually achieve other things, because they can give a point of leverage, or they can make the opponent less of a threat to you. I know that the Filipino martial arts have the defanging the snake concept. It's very similar to that, really. So, and as we see here, it also gives a good leverage point to throw. Boom, there we go. So it's really, that's a really nice, I mean, it was a bit kind of flashy on Hollywood. It wasn't exactly how it would look in a BJJ fight, should we say. But I basically like it. I basically love it. It's really well thought out. It's logically put together. And I love the fact that they're combining the use of the knife with wrestling. Really nice detail there. So the guy is over him with his dagger like this, but his stability comes from his foot on the ground. So he kicks away the foot on the ground and then diverts the dagger into the other person who's behind him or underneath him. Let's just go back a bit actually and watch that again, because it's really, really nice. Kick, bam. So well choreographed. I absolutely love it. There's so many complex things happening in a small period of time. You can watch this fight over and over again and see little details like this. It's really well done. I mean, again, it's under the blow, coming behind. It's really nicely choreographed and completely plausible. Yes, it's a bit more flashy and a bit more Hollywood, but it's basically all plausible martial arts stuff. Oh, and here comes the other boss with the hammer. We knew they were going to come. So that gauntlet and the hammer were the two standout weapons. So we knew those two guys were going to be important. So it's important for 2 points. One, because it gives this big swinging and dramatic effect with that big old hammer. But also, dong, it makes the noise, which is going to have a follow-up effect on the story. But as was demonstrated there, and I'll just go back a bit again so you can see here, I really like how bong. It's a big, slow weapon. It's easy to avoid. You could grab it because it's got a big, long wooden shaft. It's not like it's an edged blade. So this sledgehammer, shortened sledgehammer, I would argue is a terrible trench weapon. Do you disagree? Do you think it's a brilliant weapon? Because maces, you might be going, oh, well, in medieval times they used maces and warhammers, but they were way lighter than a sledgehammer. This is maybe twice the head weight. And when all the weight's at the head as well, at the end, it makes it very unwieldy. So I think this is terrible. It would have been much, much better off in a real world scenario with just a typical hatchet like you buy from the hardware store, which is a absolutely, you know, a time-honoured weapon that throughout history, from the Stone Age to now, small hatchets have been effective weapons. So why use a huge hammer, especially when there's no armour involved? And then, of course, we get the... There we go. Because of the loud noise, the machine gunners, the machine gun companies on both sides, Maxim machine guns, whatever, have kind of like gone, oh, what? And now both the British and the Germans are like, right, it must be the enemy. We're going to have to open fire. So this is a really, again, it's the big boss with the big hammer, and he's winning, even though I think in reality he wouldn't. You just go in with a small knife and he'd be mincemeat, okay? But this is part of the plot. The big baddie with the big hammer, he's noticeable. You've already noticed him at the beginning of the fight because he's got that big hammer and he's been clunking things with it. He has defeated our hero, and our hero, the person who wants to protect our hero, is going to have to make the ultimate sacrifice. There we go. He tries to use a weapon. It gets knocked out of the way with that great big sledgehammer. And there you go. So at this point, our hero's been beaten by the big boss with his big hammer. He's too powerful. He can't defeat him. So this is our Luke Skywalker, and Obi-Wan Kenobi here. Oh, there we go. He's going to get hammered. And the officer with his revolver has to come to the rescue of our hero, which of course means this. It means that the machine guns open fire, everybody dies except for the main hero. So the sacrifice was made, the plot, the story was set up, it's beautifully done. But overall, what I really want to say is this fight, short though it is, it's about 3.5 minutes long. And you can watch the unedited, or you can go and search this on YouTube and find it yourself and just watch it from beginning to end a few times. It's beautifully shot, it's atmospheric, it's tense, it's terrifying if you try and put yourself into the mindset of the people who really, just over 100 years ago, were in situations like this. Okay, this was, although this is a Hollywood version, this is real history, this is what real people had to go through. My great-grandfather and great-uncles and all of these people in my family and lots of your families were there in this absolute hellscape. May we never, ever see anything like that ever again, and let's work hard to make sure we don't. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this movie fight review. I never want to make light of movie fights that are representing bits of history, and this is especially the case because it's really not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, my great-grandparents. So And I'm sure lots of yours as well. Anyway, thanks a lot. I hope you've enjoyed this. Give us a thumbs up and please make sure you're subscribed, because well over half of people that watch my videos aren't subscribed to my channel. So it'd make a big difference to me if you'd think about clicking that subscribe button. Share the video around if you've enjoyed it, because other friends of yours might enjoy it as well. And I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel really soon. And suggestions welcome for other movie fight reviews down in the comments down below. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.